As I said, welcome everyone to the Arts Postgraduate Talks. This is series 3 called PolyCrisis. I'm going to do a quick introduction to a vague, broad introduction to what this term means and why I think we should be talking about it. And then I'm going to hand over to Mona Ali, who's our speaker today. So polycrisis is a term that came from really historians, social economic historians, and also political economists. And they were using it, they've been using it, it's a term that's actually developing now, kind of coming into use now. It's an emerging term. They're using it to think about the shocks and disruptions to world economic, political, and social systems. I've put up this slide with Adam Tooze over here, because he's kind of taken the term from policy people and bureaucrats and started to develop it as a category to do this kind of explanatory analytical work. It's kind of emerged in this first book. Actually, I think it emerged through Shutdown. Tooze is famous for these two books, which are very readable, kind of very compelling, very large as well. Crashed, which is about the 2008 financial crisis as a global systemic crisis, and the other global systemic crisis we've been through in the past 15 years, because we've had two major breakdowns of world economy. Shutdown, which is, as you can see from the book, how COVID shook the world's economy. So Tooze has a blog called Chartbook, which I strongly recommend if you want to get into details and insights into fractures and weaknesses, or weaknesses is quite the right term, fractures or crisis points in global systems. So maybe I can give you the reference to that later on. But the thing that strikes me is that both the financial crisis from 2008 and also the COVID pandemic are, of course, highly visible world-scale demonstrations of shocks, crisis moments in not just one country or one nation or even one region, but as kind of global, in a global system, because the global system is interlocked, right? So as we know through supply chains and as we know through logistics and so on, what one part of the world is doing is very dependent on another part of the world. And so if there's a crisis, like a systemic crisis down in the supply chain somewhere, it has effects all the way through. And supply chains have historically been built to be able to work around or to make other arrangements, but what's been happening more and more, demonstrated by COVID, demonstrated by, in another way, by the financial crisis, is that this capacity of the world system is kind of looking very creaky and very shaky. And I think the term polycrisis goes beyond this event-like notion of crisis, that you enter into a crisis, you deal with it, you go around it, you get to the other side of it. Polycrisis seems to suggest something else, suggests more a kind of all-round, ongoing, chronic, and unavoidable crisis, which are going to be happening all the time. It's just crisis from now on. And furthermore, these crises, these difficulties in world systems cannot be contained by existing institutions, right? So if we think about climate breakdown, it's clear that what people in one part of the world, so when Bolsonaro is tearing down the Amazon, that's not just a Brazilian issue, it's a global and planetary issue. Even if people in other parts of the world don't have legal rights or any ownership rights over the Amazon. But it has consequences elsewhere. And with climate breakdown, there's a kind of sense of interconnectedness, and institutions in any one part of the world, and even global or planetary institutions, don't really have the means to be able to address it adequately. And I think polycrisis speaks about that, speaks to that sense of difficulty and problem and unavoidability in terms of how we deal with what's coming up. So I think polycrisis suggests a good explanatory category for the sense that things are very messed up right now and things are falling apart in many directions simultaneously, which experientially, it's kind of hard to speak about or address things at that scale. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as people involved in cultural production, which is about making images of the world. But experientially, I think the sense of polycrisis comes out as this kind of increasingly common phrase that the future is profoundly uncertain. We just don't know what's going to happen, both short-term, medium-term, and certainly very long-term. But also that institutions and systems, as I've said before, which were meant to provide some sense of stability, are incapable of doing that. And also they're incapable of managing the present or the future as well. And the overall feeling, which I think is prevailing now, not just in poor countries where this has historically been prevalent, but also now in richer countries and even at the core of richer countries. If you think about the ruling party in Britain, for example, is a sense of deep insecurity and precariousness, which is not just personal, but also institutional and social. So that's the broad notion of polycrisis. I'm sure Mona will have more to say about it and my partial characterization of it. But before I introduce Mona, I just want to say why I thought it'd be interesting and important to speak about this in an art context. Right? So why polycrisis for art, and what can art do for polycrisis? Now, I think one thing, so these talks, if you remember the introduction from quite a while ago, these talks are about setting up a sort of a background condition to consider what we're up to as emerging artists, curators, theorists, writers, cultural producers now for you who are like the emerging generation, but also for the next little while, which is what you will emerge into and what you will make as the next phase of cultural and meaning production. Right? And it seems to me that polycrisis, for the reasons I've said, has immense relevance for what we're up to in the art field. And I think we can identify that if we place it in a broad, kind of very crude caricature or crude image of social systems. So this is something that I'm going to try out. May not work. Let's try it. Okay. So here's a potted history of the last 220 years in one slide. All right. So if you think about capitalist orders, right? Colonial industrialism was happening between 1820s, say, dates a little bit dodgy, up to about the 1980s, because I think that's when the colonial period sort of started to kind of enter into terminal phase. And industrialism moved from the historical centers, which were Europe, North America, South America, also the Soviet region, and moved over to East Asia, especially, and that's the emergence of China now as a kind of dominant global actor. But the thing to notice is the kind of subjecthood that accompanied this period of colonial industrialism. And of course, the bourgeoisie were the heroes of this moment. And the working classes were also the heroes, but of another kind, especially in the Soviet space. But the bourgeoisie understood themselves through their class identifications, as did the working class. And what the bourgeoisie did was put forward their values and the values that they operated along as a kind of universal condition, okay? Not just like to do with the nation state, which is of course the kind of agent for the action of the bourgeoisie was the nation state. But the nation state, if you think of like French republicanism or even in a sense American republicanism, the values put forward to announce the liberty of the nation state were universal values, right? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a kind of consequence of that idea. But also the bourgeoisie is a public actor. And the kind of art that accompanies this kind of subject was, of course, modern art. Right? So modern art starts in this period, and it kind of has its specific type of art making, which sort of represents some of these values, but also the counterpoint of like working class, universalism, working class, publicness. Modern art took a significant role in doing that as well. But that's not where we are anymore. Where we are is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as a kind of ideology, as a doctrine, as a kind of economic practice, kicked off in the 1970s. The first success for neoliberals, not for the people, was of course in Chile when Pinochet took advice from neoliberal theorists in Chicago. But then it got rolled out through Reagan and Thatcher and the rest of it. And we're still in it because it just won't die. We're in a kind of zombie neoliberalism at the moment, I think. And the main character for that is really the entrepreneur, right? And as much, it's not on the slide, but as much as the bourgeoisie was the actor of the nation state, the entrepreneur is an actor of the market. But of course, the market isn't localized. The market happens everywhere, but it's globally interconnected markets. Okay, so the entrepreneur is, of course, an individual, rather than identifies themselves through their individualism, rather than through their class status. The entrepreneur is a global actor rather than a universal actor. So no entrepreneur says that their values are true for all time for everyone. They're just their own values, but through those you can connect with other people on the planet, recognizing our diversity and our differences. And the entrepreneur doesn't act publicly, the entrepreneur acts personally. Okay? And of course, the type of art that accompanies this figure and this configuration is contemporary art, of which Goldsmith's MFA has been a privileged beneficiary. Right? So that's where we've been. I think we've been there for about 40 years, I think, in its kind of full form. It does seem to be going through a lot of crisis. And one of the interesting questions that we constantly have to think about is, why won't neoliberalism die? Because it really should. After the 2008 crash, there's a great sense that that was kind of the end of this configuration and we were entering a new space, but somehow we're in this sort of weird hybrid moment where it hasn't quite gone, but it's still no longer functioning in its kind of peak form, right? So it seems to me that there's been a kind of set of arguments, a set of claims that the 2008 crash was really the kind of practical beginning of what we might call post-neoliberalism. This is kicked off in the 2010s. If it kicked off, because I said we're not clearly in one or the other of neoliberalism or post-neoliberalism. But if you accept this formation, then the question is what's happening in terms of what kind of subject would be the kind of post-neoliberal actor, and what kind of art would that mean? And that's really, I think, what we need to be thinking about as a kind of background condition for what art is now up to. It doesn't seem to me that contemporary art can really do the work that's needed, adequate to kind of post-neoliberal phase. But where I think PolyCrisis comes into it is that PolyCrisis seems to me a description in terms of the inadequacy or the dysfunction or the inappropriateness of the institutions of neoliberalism and even colonial industrialism, which are the main institutions that we have to deal with this new phase. And because clearly the institutions of colonial industrialism and neoliberalism can't deal with, for example, what's needed on a planetary scale to deal with climate breakdown. Okay, and the kind of not just the material impact of these crises, so the storms, the fires, the destruction of the atmosphere, and so on. The crisis isn't just there; it's also in the forms of agency and action, which can engage with these and deal with them, turn them back into old school crises, if you want. Right. So PolyCrisis, to me, Mona might have a different sense of it. We'll find out soon. Seems to me to be a kind of the way in which previous formations are creaking and are kind of not quite falling apart because they continue to exist, but they're in crisis basically on many fronts simultaneously as we transition out of neoliberalism into whatever is next. And of course, the question that comes up for this rather small, but I think significant area that we work with in the cultural sector is what is a version of PolyCrisis that affects forms of subjecthood, and what does PolyCrisis indicate in terms of art, but also the other way around, what can art do when confronted with the condition of polycrisis? All right, so that's the my motivation for why polycrisis, and this is the talks. These are the talks that we'll have. So today, Mona Ali will be presenting. I'll introduce Mona in a minute. Next week, it's Bahar Nourizadeh, who's an artist who's doing a PhD at Goldsmiths, actually, talking about neoliberalism and the kind of what she calls metaphysics of neoliberalism, which promotes uncertainty and requires uncertainty as kind of basic condition for how people make money. And that has kind of, I think, well, Bahar will explain more the consequences of that, both socially and artistically. Gary Sexy Zhang, some of you will know if you're on the MFA Fine Art, because he's now teaching with us. We'll be talking about insurance as a scheme or a mechanism by which this future uncertainty can get operationalized and get turned into not just an economy or a kind of profit-making scheme, but a way to kind of continue to produce a sense of some certainty as well as uncertainty, which kind of gives a sense of the types of institutions that can deal with crises, polycrises, radical uncertainties. And then the last talk, which will be after reading week, so there's going to be a 2-week gap between Gary's talk and the final talk by Miyu. Miyu will be talking about how institutions are dealing with polycrisis, and I'm waiting to hear back from Miyu with kind of an outline of the talk. All right, so that's the series.